Coming up on Arirang News. South Korea's current account surplus extended for the 8th month in a row in December on the back of a stronger growth in exports led by semiconductors and automobiles. Russia's ambassador to North Korea says there could be another nuclear test by the regime because of the U.S.'s provocations. Ahead of Putin's possible trip to Pyongyang, South Korea holds talks with China and Russia. Ahead of the 2024 general election, this week is the last chance for some 2 million Koreans living overseas who are eligible to vote to register so they can cast their ballots. We take a look at how it's done and the significance. Good evening. It's 9 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us on Arirang News. We start with the latest trade data. In December last year, South Korea's current account surplus extended for the 8th consecutive month thanks to solid growth in exports led by semiconductors and cars. Our economics correspondent An Sung-jin leads us off.
South Korea's current account balance for December last year saw a surplus yet again on the back of strong exports. According to preliminary data released by the Bank of Korea on Wednesday, the current account saw a monthly surplus for the 8th consecutive month, with the surplus for December standing at $7.41 billion. This is mostly due to improving exports, which grew 5% compared to a year earlier as the value of semiconductor exports jumped. Auto exports also continued their upward trend with an on-year increase of 19.2%. Though exports to the EU and China dropped, shipments to US and Southeast Asia were both up.
As demand for electric vehicles dropped, automobile and mechanical product exports to the EU fell. Exports to China declined as manufacturing plants moved to Vietnam. With investment in batteries increasing in the US, exports to the US are expected to rise.
The strong performance of exports and the falling imports led the goods account to also see a surplus of $8 billion in December. The services account, which tracks the inflow and outflow of business services, tourism, and transportation, posted a $2.54 billion deficit due to fewer tourists from Japan. For the year 2023 as a whole, the current account surplus stood at $35.49 billion, nearly $10 billion higher than the year before. The official noted that the positive trend will continue next year.
In 2024, the expected current account surplus is $49 billion, and it is $59 billion in 2025 as the IT industry recovers and maintains its strong performance.
An Sung-jin, Arirang News.
And rebounding chip exports have eased the economic slowdown due to a sluggish domestic spending. The Korea Development Institute on Wednesday released a report pointing to how a rise in semiconductor exports, jumping 56.2% on-year in January, helped mitigate poor economic performance in other areas. The country has been grappling with high interest rates, which turn back customers from buying goods and using services. The think tank also warned that the conflict in the Middle East was an economic risk factor that could contribute to oil price hikes going forward. Battery use for EVs worldwide grew in 2023, despite the recent slowdown in growth of the electric vehicle market. According to market research company SNE Research on Wednesday, the amount of energy held by batteries for EVs registered around the world grew by more than 38%. While the combined market share of South Korea's top 3 battery firms fell in 2023, overall use of their batteries continued to grow year on year with rising sales of new vehicle models. Notably, LG Energy Solution ranked 3rd overall for annual battery use growth, coming in behind China's CATL and BYD. Now we focus on another critical issue in Korean society. The country's chronically low birth rate has been making headlines for quite some time, prompting authorities to come up with more measures. As our Park Gun-woo reports, people have issues of their own when it comes to starting or maintaining a family. Take a look.
South Korea is quickly becoming known for its aging population, with the number of new births recorded on a downward trend. According to data from Statistics Korea, the total fertility rate in 2022 was 0.78. Figures for 2023 are set to be released at the end of February, and experts say that figure could fall even further. But what's behind these dwindling numbers? I went out on the streets of Seoul to find out why people are reluctant to have kids.
The parents usually have some big pressure, good school, good nursery, good kindergartens, so education fee, and the others is really, really expensive.
With higher prices, sufficient earnings are needed to take care of a child.
Housing issues need to be solved, and also education fees.
Along with the expense of having kids, some pointed to the difficulty associated with raising children and working at the same time. The importance of alone time by young adults is seen as another factor driving the number of births down. In response, the government introduced several policies this year, including an increase in financial support to encourage people to have more kids. But many young adults I spoke to said they wouldn't think too differently despite strengthening governmental support.
Several policies that can actually help people to settle down are needed more than monetary support.
People also spoke about the need for better conditions for parents returning to work after a child is born. One expert suggested ways to encourage people to have children.
Among OECD nations, Korea is on the upper rankings of working hours, so realistically, parents can't concentrate on raising kids, even if they have them. Working hours need to be shorter.
And he said more companies will need to allow people to use parental leaves more flexibly. With the government's target of raising the total fertility rate to 1 birth per woman, the Presidential Committee on Aging Society and Population Policy also said it will be releasing a comprehensive plan, possibly in March, to solve issues related to the country's low birth and fertility rate. Park Gun-woo, Arirang News.
Moving on, there's little over 60 days to go until the 2024 general election. And this week is the last chance for some 2 million Koreans living overseas who are eligible to vote to register so they can cast their ballots. Our National Assembly correspondent Lee Si-hoo explains its process and the significance.
Overseas Koreans earned the right to vote in 2012 after filing a petition to the Constitutional Court. Now, Korean citizens without a permanent address in Korea can vote for proportional representatives in the assembly. Those with a permanent address may vote for both proportional and regional lawmakers. They can cast their vote at selected diplomatic offices or alternative locations. Voters must register no later than 60 days before the actual voting day here in South Korea. Then, voting will open for 6 days anytime between 14 to 9 days before the election day. But in the general and presidential elections since 2012, only about 10% of the total eligible overseas voters registered to vote. Of those, only 28% showed up to vote in past general elections.
There are practical constraints in overseas voting. Mail-in voting is not available, and polling stations are far away from where people live. There are also inconveniences in the voting process due to limited space, and also during voter registration.
But the National Election Commission is doing a lot to support its voters. It's installed an overseas election commission in diplomatic offices and dispatched attachés to help the voting process.
We are actively promoting overseas voting through local Korean media and Korean communities. The U.S. Embassy in Washington, where I am, is accepting many registrations until the last minute. Registering online is the most convenient method, so we ask those overseas who haven't registered to vote to do so on the NEC website or by other methods by February 10th.
Meanwhile, rival lawmakers are strongly encouraging overseas Koreans to go out and cast their votes. Lawmaker Kim Seok-gi of the ruling People Power Party, who also heads the party's Committee for Overseas Koreans, says that every vote matters and that the PPP will continue to lead the improvement of the overseas election system. The main opposition Democratic Party lawmaker Lee Yong-sun, who leads the Democratic Congress of Global Koreans, says that it's the Assembly's responsibility to provide the right assistance for voters.
In the upcoming important election that will determine the direction of the state, they have much interest in exercising their right to participate. I think as an advanced country, it is our role to make sure they can participate in the upcoming general election.
Both the lawmakers spoke of other methods such as mail-in ballots, but did say that careful review and discussions are needed before they can be employed. Lee Si-hu, Arirang News.
Russia's ambassador to North Korea says there could be another nuclear test by the regime should the U.S. continue its provocations. Also mentioned was preparations being made for Russian President Vladimir Putin's potential trip to Pyongyang in the near future. Our Kim Jong-sil has this report.
Russia's ambassador to Pyongyang made it clear that any potential conflict on the Korean peninsula will surely depend on the U.S., as North Korea is not seeking a war here. In an interview with Russian news agency TASS on Wednesday, Ambassador Alexander Matsugarov said Pyongyang may decide to conduct a 7th nuclear test if the U.S. continues to, quote, take provocative steps in the region. The Russian envoy recounted North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's remarks at the regime's Supreme People's Assembly meeting back in January.
There is no reason for us to opt for war. Therefore, we have no intention of unilaterally going to war. But if it does become a reality, we will never try to avoid it.
Ambassador Matsugarov added that if U.S. provocations against the North continue, such as, quote, U.S. Air Force strategic bombers continue to fly over the peninsula, the North Korean leadership may as well decide to conduct a new nuclear test for the sake of further strengthening of its defense capabilities. He noted the responsibility for such unwelcome developments will, quote, lie completely with Washington and with Seoul too, even though he admitted that little depends on the South Korean side. Regarding Russian President Vladimir Putin's planned visit to Pyongyang, the envoy said one of the documents to be signed between the leaders of North Korea and Russia was being prepared, adding that it's an agreement on mutual trips by citizens between North Korea and Russia. He did not, however, specify a timeline for Putin's visit. With growing interaction, the New York Times reported on Tuesday that Russia has allowed a partial release of frozen North Korean assets and may be helping Pyongyang with access to Russian banks. Kim Jong-sil, Arirang News.
And against this backdrop, South Korea holds talks with China and Russia, discussing an array of issues, including North Korea. Our Peunji explains complicated diplomacy surrounding the Korean peninsula.
Almost about a month after South Korea's new foreign minister Cho Tae-il was appointed, he spoke on the phone with his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi for the first time. During the 15-minute call on Tuesday evening, Wang invited Cho to visit Beijing to develop bilateral relations further. In response, Cho agreed to schedule a visit via diplomatic channels at a time that's convenient for both sides. The two also agreed on the importance of managing supply chain stability and decided to seek new sources of development through deepening bilateral trade and investment. On North Korea, Cho urged Beijing to play a constructive role in bringing Pyongyang back to dialogue and expressed concerns about North Korean defectors being forcibly sent back to the north by China. Over the weekend, Russia's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andrei Rudenko, visited Seoul. Rudenko met with high-level South Korean officials, including National Security Advisor Chang Ho-jin and First Vice Foreign Minister Kim Hong-kyun. Seoul expressed concerns about Russia's military cooperation with North Korea and called on the two to act responsibly. But at the same time, South Korea and Russia agreed that further communication was needed for both countries' benefit. It's been a while since a Russian official has traveled to South Korea. In fact, it's the first time since President Yoon Suk-yeol took office in May 2022. This recent contact shows both countries' commitment to managing bilateral relations and preventing them from worsening, but challenges still remain. Watchers say the ongoing momentum for dialogue between the two countries is crucial ahead of Vladimir Putin's possible visit to North Korea after the Russian presidential election in March. 배은지, Arirang News.
Details of arms deal between South Korea and Saudi Arabia that was sealed last November were disclosed earlier this week. The two countries penned a memorandum of understanding to bolster defense partnership on the sidelines of the World Defense Show in Riyadh. Our Lee Eun-hee reports.
South Korea has announced a deal to export to Saudi Arabia 10 M-SAM-2 mid-range surface-to-air missile batteries. According to Seoul's Defense Ministry on Tuesday, the deal, worth some 4.2 trillion Korean won, or $3.2 billion was sealed last November between South Korean defense firm LIGNX-1 and the Saudi Arabian Defense Ministry. The M-SAM-2, known locally as Cheongcheong-do missiles, are a core weapon system of Korea air and missile defense. The so-called Korean Patriot uses hit-to-kill missiles capable of intercepting incoming missiles at an altitude of 30 to 40 kilometers. The advanced technology system includes simultaneous engagement of multiple targets, high mobility with canard and side jet thrusters, and direct targeting with a power-enhancing warhead. This is LIGNX-1's second export deal, as it previously signed the deal with the United Arab Emirates in 2022. Tuesday's announcement comes as South Korea and Saudi Arabia have agreed to further strengthen their defense cooperation. As part of this week's visit to the Middle East, South Korea's Defense Minister Shin Won-sik met with Saudi Arabia's Defense Minister on Sunday in Riyadh. The two sides signed the Memorandum of Understanding to establish a joint committee to cooperate in research and weapons development in the mid to long term. On Tuesday, Shin visited Qatar and signed an MOU on furthering the two countries' defense and arms cooperation in light of the 50th anniversary of their diplomatic relations this year. Lee Eun-hee, Arirang News.
Moving on to the situation in Ukraine. At least 3 people were killed in Russian airstrikes that took place on Wednesday morning. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said via the Telegram messaging app that 2 people had been killed in the capital Kyiv, with more than 10 injured. Local authorities reported that 1 person was killed in Mykolaiv, southern Ukraine. The Ukrainian Air Force put the whole country under air alert at around 6 a.m. Kyiv's mayor said the Russian missiles damaged power lines and left some households without electricity. In the Middle East, peace mediators claim Hamas has shared a largely favorable response to the latest framework for a truce in return for hostages. Lee Seung-jae has the latest.
Qatar says Hamas has given a generally positive response to a proposed truce deal with Israel, as the militant group reiterated its call for an end to the Israeli assault on Gaza. According to Qatari Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammed Al Thani, Hamas had a positive response to the proposed deal being brokered by the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt, but did not provide further details. Hamas said in a statement that its leadership had reviewed the ceasefire deal with a positive spirit, including details of securing relief and shelter, reconstruction, the lifting of a 17-year-old crippling siege, and the completion of the prisoner exchange process. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who is once again in the Middle East, will meet with Israeli officials and discuss the proposed truce deal. Meanwhile, Israel Defense Forces spokesman Daniel Hagari said Tuesday that more than $150 million were transferred from Iran to the militant group, adding the funds were utilized by Hamas to sustain its operations underground. Hagari also underscored the implications of Iran's support for terrorism, adding it may extend beyond the Middle East region. Updating on the Israeli hostages held by Hamas, the spokesman said that 31 of the hostages held in Gaza are confirmed to have died. Israel has said 136 hostages are still being held in Gaza. With the armed conflict between Israel and Hamas now spanning 4 months, the UN says Israel's evacuation orders in the Gaza Strip now cover 2/3 of the territory. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs said Tuesday that more than half of Gaza's population is now crammed into the town of Rafah on the border with Egypt and surrounding areas. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
A U.S. federal appeals court has ruled that former President Donald Trump does not have immunity from charges that he plotted to overturn his 2020 election defeat. Mr. Trump is likely to appeal the ruling. Chung Eun-ju tells us more.
A federal appeals court ruled on Tuesday that former U.S. President Donald Trump is not immune from prosecution for alleged crimes committed during his presidency. A three-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit rejected Mr. Trump's claim that he cannot be prosecuted because the allegations relate to his official responsibilities as president. The unanimous panel wrote in a 57-page opinion that it could not accept that former presidents are above the law for all the time thereafter. The court concluded that any executive immunity no longer protects him against this prosecution. The ruling, which Mr. Trump vowed to appeal, rebuffs his attempt to avoid a trial on charges that he undermined American democracy and the transfer of power, even as he consolidates his position as the frontrunner for the Republican presidential nomination. Mr. Trump has until Monday to ask the Supreme Court to temporarily block the ruling to delay his case again from heading to trial. A Trump campaign spokesperson said that although there would be an appeal, did not specify whether the full D.C. Circuit Court would be asked to review the ruling or go to the U.S. Supreme Court directly. A spokesperson for Special Counsel Jack Smith, who is leading the prosecution, declined to comment. Donald Trump has made no secret that his overarching legal strategy is to seek delays, because if he were to win the 2024 presidential election in November and the trial had not yet started or had not been completed, he could appoint a loyalist as the Attorney General who would drop the charges against him. Chung Eun-ju, Arirang News.
Relatively mild weather continued throughout the day with cloudy skies around the country. The area is expected to be murky from tonight. As smoke from overseas gradually flows in, the concentration of ultrafine dust will increase from tonight. By tomorrow, air quality is expected to be bad in Seoul metropolitan area and Chungcheong-do provinces. Please wear a mask on your way to work in these areas. The temperatures have been higher than usual in the morning, but tomorrow the cold will return to what's usually seen this time of year. Seoul will see -3 degrees and -5 in Chuncheon. The daytime temperatures will be about 2 to 3 degrees higher than today, making the daily temperatures differences widen. Looking at the morning temperatures, Daejeon will start off at -4, Gwangju and Daegu -2 degrees. Daily highs will move up to 6 in Seoul, 10 in Gyeongju and Busan. There's no need to worry about major cold during this Lunar New Year holiday, which is coming up this weekend. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
Well, that is all for this newscast tonight. Thank you for watching. We'll be back at 10 p.m. with the AI headline news. Good night.